You're listening to a Whales Are Whales production.
You're also listening to Whales.
Visit whalesorwhales.com for more projects and shows like this one.
Welcome to episode 11 of Third Person, a storytelling podcast. Today's topic is going to be high fantasy, and joining me to discuss this are my good friends, pals, and cohorts, Steven. Hello, Steven.
Oh, hi, Brian. I'm very glad that we're back to third person instead of second person, because that's a much easier viewpoint to keep track of.
Exactly. No one actually knows what second person is, except Abigail, who is also joining me today. Hello, Abigail.
Hello. I actually prefer second person. Steven, leave.
Okay.
Oh. Gosh.
What?
This is starting brutal.
Is that coming out again? I keep thinking these thoughts, and usually they stay inside, but...
Pop quiz, Abigail. What is second person like
you.
In terms of storytelling?
It's you.
No.
Yes.
What?
Yes.
I love that. All right, and I am Brian, your host and benevolent dictator.
What?
So, guys.
Hi, Brian.
What?
Nothing.
What?
Said hi.
Oh, hi.
Benevolent dictator. It's the most interesting kind.
Exactly. Everyone likes a good benevolent dictator.
I feel
before we discuss our main topic here, I wanted to ask you guys a question.
Shoot.
What
have you been narratively involved with?
I love this question.
I actually wasn't expecting that question.
Abigail, it is literally written on the show notes.
I scrolled down too far. I didn't see it. I have this big old main topic staring me in the face.
Pop quiz. Steven, your section is blank, so we're going to start with you, because you're obviously the least well prepared.
Yes, I'm very ill prepared
and I am obviously a good podcast host. So
yeah. I mean, you start with low expectations and work your way up. I get it.
The tough questions. I'm going to grill you
Save the best for last, you know?
Until you are a sobbing mess.
So I may not be well prepared, but I have been narratively involved with several things recently.
All right.
One that I was doing just last night was playing the second chapter of Life is Strange.
Steven?
Yeah?
What is life is or was?
It is currently strange.
What is Life is Strange?
Well, what Life is Strange is, Brian, is... It's an episodic video game series.
Is it?
Yes. Last I checked, it totally is.
Cool.
And it's sort of like an adventure game if you played any of the Telltale adventure games like Walking Dead or Game of Thrones or something. But this one is not...
those are all TV shows.
Yeah, well, that's the big difference is Telltale is not here just, making up some crazy television spin-off property, but it is the people who made a game called Remember Me, which is a kind of a strange action-adventure beat-em-up science fiction French thing, which I quite like, despite the gameplay not being so great. But the good thing about this game, Life is Strange, is that it doesn't really have gameplay. So they just stick right to they get right to the character development and weird time manipulation.
All right.
And one could almost argue that it's a bit of low fantasy or low sci-fi.
Ooh.
Because it takes place in a normal world, a high school, in fact. So maybe it's in the high fantasy genre. I don't know.
That's a stretch.
But you find out pretty soon that you've got time powers and you can reverse time to, I don't know, maybe a minute or so in the past.
Okay.
So you meet many characters along the way, and it's all about the choices you get to make in high school. And out of the high school, too. It's actually more fun once you get to leave the high school.
Well, that is an accurate representation of life.
Yes, that life is strange.
It gets...
It's very cool. It's a little bit stilted, both animation-wise and character-wise. But I am certainly enjoying it. Especially when things start to get really heated and tense, and sometimes you have to make choices quickly. And so, for one example is... I ended up basically escaping this horrible dude at the school who was out to get me.
Was he the guy with the gun?
Yeah, he might have had a gun at some point.
Okay.
he's on my tail, and so my
Gotcha.
old friend, Chloe swoops in and saves me. This isn't really much of a spoiler. I'll keep it spoilerish free-ish. But we end up ditching the school and heading back to her house. And we just were hanging out in her room for like a long time. And I was just poring over all of the old things that were like stuck to her wall and the
sounds like
CD
Gone Home.
collection she has. It is a lot like Gone Home, which was in one of another awesome sort of off the rails adventure game.
Yes.
But needless to say, is it needless to say if I haven't said it yet?
Nope. It is
Okay.
needed. It is needed to
definitely
say.
needed.
Needing to say it's a very detailed little world, and it's really fun to poke around in it, and I like it a lot. And when you had to make those choices, it's kind of tense and it's fun.
So it's episodic.
Mm-hmm.
How often are they on a schedule for the episodes, or are they just
like
hey,
a really loose schedule,
Okay.
like maybe the next month or so.
Okay.
You never
So it's
really
like our
know.
podcast.
Yeah, not at all. We're actually pretty good schedule wise.
I know.
But I'm on episode 2, which is pretty good so far. Crazy thing though, and I tweeted about this a while back.
Yes.
Remember when I told you about the 2-whale diner ad that I found?
Right.
Abigail, I'll have to send you a picture of this, or you could just look up the Whales or Whales Twitter account, whatever you want to do. But
I'm looking
there
for
was
it.
an advertisement stuck to a refrigerator for a restaurant that has a logo that is strikingly similar to Whales or Whales.
Oh.
Like, we're talking 2 whales with the same bobble eye, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And the same colors of the whales,
Jeez.
one big and one little, the same text color. Like, it's extremely
So basically
similar.
what you're saying is we really want this game to be financially successful so that when we sue them, we have more money to pull from.
Either that, or the developers have time manipulation powers themselves and went back in time and found out about our logo. The crazy
Don't have
thing
to
is,
go
though,
back in time to find out about our logo.
really, has it been around that long?
A
No?
year?
Who knows? But this game was in development for a while.
They could have added that in later.
I don't know, because in episode 2, you get to go to the 2 Whales Diner. It's a big, major part of the game.
Am I
So
there?
that logo is everywhere.
Wow.
Yeah, crazy.
That's crazy.
Anyway, life is strange.
Yeah,
friends.
life is strange.
Life is strange. But other things I've been narratively involved in, I just finished the 3rd season of Gilmore Girls.
Good for you.
Whoa, nice.
Yeah, to the part where Jess is away and Rory is go away.
That's specific.
What?
Yep.
Are they eloping?
No, Jess just left town and
Oh.
Rory's about to graduate
Oh,
high school.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I still really like that show. But it just hit me that it's going to end eventually.
Yeah.
But it's gonna be a while. Don't worry, you'll probably get tired of it by the time it ends.
Probably so.
That almost happened with Buffy.
Yeah, almost. There were certainly parts where I was ready to put Buffy down.
For sure.
But, yeah. And otherwise, last thing I guess I'll mention, I've been listening to a book about Grand Moff Tarkin.
Okay, is this a nonfiction book? I really hope this is a nonfiction.
I desperately wish it was a nonfiction
Like,
book.
not
but no,
necessarily
it's-
nonfiction. I should say, like, it's like a
Nonfiction within
biography
fiction?
of a fictional character. That would be amazing.
Man, I don't understand what that concept is. I wish we had done an episode about nonfiction and fiction and fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah, too bad we're bad at things. So
Yep,
really.
so bad at things.
So that's
yeah,
interesting. It's like
It's
I
a story
assume
about
a novel.
Grand Moff Tarkin, who is the dude who is holding Vader's leash from Star Wars Episode 4.
Right, he's the evil-looking, bony British dude in the first A New Hope.
And you find out why he's bony and why he's British through his
Oh, really?
backstory. Well, sort of. It's okay so far. I've got to say it's kind of jumping between slightly predictable flashbacks and kind of boring present politics.
Well, you're describing a lot of Star Wars books.
Yeah. But it's personally,
Is there a scene where Luke is meditating for like 7 hours?
well, Luke is currently not even in the womb yet, so
Okay, so probably not.
no, not in
Safe
that
to say.
flashback. It's okay. I sort of feel like they should have taken a more non-traditional approach. where it kind of feels like I didn't need to know such a by the numbers raising of Tarkin.
Oh, yeah. Did he have like bullies in the school he was going to?
Well, no, not quite like that. Just finding out about his parents and about this weird ritual they made him go to, and like not a cult ritual, just like go survive in the jungle. That's how he got so tough. It's like it almost feels like an excuse. Like the reason Tarkin is so, you know, sharp and manipulative is because he had such a, you know, rough, difficult time growing up. And it was so harsh. Right. And I just kind of thought it would be cooler if he just, you know, figured stuff out. That's why I don't ever want to know the true history of Emperor Palpatine.
You know a lot of it.
Do you?
Well, I guess it's not canon anymore, is it?
You're right. None of this is canon anymore.
The Plagueis book told a lot about a Palpatine. Like, most of it.
I guess that's true.
Like, all he was a normal, like, adolescent, Senator Hopeful who resented his father.
You're right. You're right. And that was a much better story
plot. It was a really good story plot. I liked it a lot. It was
so go read the book about Darth Plagueis, not Tarkin.
But granted, that is not true anymore. I mean, in terms of Star Wars canon, Disney has disavowed anything.
Did you ever really believe that there was a rebel pilot with the head of a horse anyway?
Well, yeah. Yes, I did. My hopes were crushed, though. For people who don't know, Disney has said everything that wasn't, I believe, the movies and the Clone Wars animated series is not canon, including like Knights of the Old Republic and Ewoks.
Wait.
And everything else people have made.
Oh, the Ewoks.
No, the Ewoks TV series, not Ewoks themselves.
What about the movie? Is that real?
There was an animated cartoon about Ewoks.
Is there really an animated cartoon about Ewoks?
Yeah, there was also one called Droids about C-3PO and R2-D2 and a guy with a mullet.
I feel like I heard about that one.
Yep. They were both pretty dumb.
Well, I think I watched them before I watched the movies.
It's an animated series about Ewoks.
And it was also like in the late 80s or early 90s. So,
man, I gotta look this up.
Yeah, you should.
I so gotta look this up.
There's an episode where Wicket learns not to use magic because it ended up like he was trying to do it to save time and it ended up starting to destroy everything. I think it was Wicket anyway.
It's kind of a cross between Star Wars Episode 6
and the Smurfs.
And this, yes, that's exactly what I was looking for. All right, so that's what I've been narratively involved with.
Yep. Great. Abigail.
Yes.
What have you been narratively involved with?
I've actually been narratively involved with something this time.
Yay!
Yay!
It's not Friends?
I have been narratively involved with Friends, but considering I'm watching it through for the second time, I figure I probably shouldn't talk about it because
probably not.
I've already talked about it, and the episodes are really not that different from each other.
Yep. They make jokes.
They make
potentially suggestive jokes, and then they laugh about them, and then they have relationship troubles.
Oh, yes.
And then they sit around in their apartments, and the show ends.
It's pretty much like Gilmore Girls, only a little bit less story per episode and a lot more scripted.
Yeah.
It's kind of...
there's a laugh track, correct?
No, it's live audience, actually.
Okay, there's a live audience, correct?
Yes.
So I use those interchangeably. I just mean there are people laughing over the show.
There are people laughing. It's really funny, actually, because I was watching recently and I was listening with like really good earbuds. Earbuds.
Oh Lord!
Who's listening?
Sounds incredibly uncomfortable.
They kept squirming.
They were really good ones.
They're like trying to crawl in my ear. It was just really. Anyways,
exactly.
But I was listening with some really good earbuds, and somebody made a joke, and then everybody laughed, and you could tell that it was not a pre-recorded laugh track, because you could hear somebody in the audience who happened to be really close to the microphone, like, repeat the joke.
Oh,
like,
really?
You know how when you do that, somebody will say something funny and then you repeat the same thing? They did that. And I was listening, I was like, oh my gosh, I just heard that. Like, that was totally live. That's awesome.
That's pretty funny.
That reminds me of my favorite recording of Oblivion music. It's like a suite of like most of the songs in one huge like orchestral feat. And just like I can count the beats, or just like I can know the approach of every string, there's a certain time when in the background you hear and that goes on in my head as I'm listening, just effortlessly, like everything else.
Is this the Oblivion song?
It's the play live video game.
I know
music.
exactly what you're talking about, and I know the cough too.
Man, I'm gonna have to listen to this too. I never caught that.
Yep.
That's awesome.
It's amazing.
It's also an amazing song.
Anyways, so besides Friends, what I've been narratively involved with is Legion Skin Deep by Brandon Sanderson.
Hey, I love the Legion series.
Yeah. I actually have not read the first one.
That's all I've read.
The second one, though, came up on my Audible thing, and it's like, hey, this is free. Or no, it wasn't free. It was like super cheap or something. It was like $1. And so I was like, hey, Brandon Sanderson, hey, short book. I can do that. And so I got it. And I listened to it, and it was probably 3 or 4 hours long. It was over, it's Audible. I listened to it in the car, and it was really, really good. And what was great, actually, was I knew it was the second one in the series, and I knew that I wasn't going to read the first before I went to this one, because I already had this one. But the way that they're written, you actually don't need to read the first one to understand everything that's going on in the second one. Or like the characters or anything like that. Like, I had a great experience with the book without ever reading the first one. And it was really cool. It's basically about a guy. I mean, y'all know this, but our podcasters don't. It's about a guy who solves crimes. He seems to be like a private detective person. And he has a lot of knowledge in a lot of different areas, but the way he has to access that knowledge is by creating a secondary persona for that knowledge. So he's pretty much a walking schizophrenic, and has all these people he can talk to. And there's a lot of things that hold him back from using his knowledge the way that we would think he could. Like, he can't just pull anything out at one time. The people that store that knowledge for him have to be, like, with him at the time. And the thing that I found most interesting about that was he can't just make them appear. Like, he has to mold his not reality into reality, even though he knows that his not reality is not reality.
Like, my favorite example of that is when the stakes are getting high, and then someone drives off with them, leaving all of his personas behind.
That was
and so he
good.
starts to invent, like, one of his really, rough and tumble, always there with a pistol dudes who should be following him around. Basically, a bodyguard is running after the car and leaping over obstacles, and eventually the protagonist slowly realizes there is no possible way he could be physically doing this. And so the persona starts to slow down as reality creeps in. He's like, nope, can't pull that off.
It was really good. It was really well done,
awesome.
too. Like, that was a really good way, honestly, for Brandon to raise the stakes, for a guy who has everything and who can do everything. And it's like, oh, well, you're cut off from all your knowledge. You have one little persona with you who happened to stay in the car.
Yeah.
And so you have one way to solve this. And so it was a really good way to make him defenseless. And, it's a good pitch, too.
Yep,
Whenever we talk about the 7-point plot structure, that was a good pitch, too.
We need to do an episode on that. Interesting. We haven't yet. But yeah, I found that premise really fascinating as well. I only read the first book, but it really hooked me. I didn't like the ending. It was really abrupt. I don't know.
Don't tell me.
Steven.
I haven't read it.
No, of the first book. Yeah, don't. I won't spoil it. It was just abrupt. It didn't really conclude very much. It wasn't very interesting. Do you remember that, Steven?
Yeah, and the second book didn't really do anything with it.
So yeah, it felt
I have
like
a feeling I know what the ending of the first one is.
The funny story about the first book is I believe he started and finished it on a plane trip.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
So I'm pretty sure he's just like, we're landing. Okay, done.
And see, it's an amazing concept, and it's a fun book with some cool characters. My only real problem with it is that both books, for whatever reason, I can just see Brandon Sanderson sitting down and writing it. Like, it doesn't feel very convincing to me. It seems like he's using his limited research to talk about things like guns and computer systems, and it doesn't feel very real to me.
A little bit of it felt like it was pandering. Like, I mean, there's a couple topics where somebody will go in and explain something way too simply. Maybe it's just because I happen to know about that topic, but I'm like, who wouldn't know that? And why are you saying this so obviously? But I think they were talking about computer coding or something, and talking about like how you can make notes in code or something like that. And I'm like, how does everyone not know this? But then again, I know how to code, so that could be it.
Yeah.
It just, there was a couple of times when I found that it wasn't super, it could have been given a little more thought, because some of it could have been done a little better.
It's a little skin deep.
That was really bad.
Har har har.
I thought it was awesome.
It was pretty good.
Thank you.
As is the book.
Thank you.
a
But
cop
yeah,
show,
to me,
though?
it very much, it sounds like a talented writer who's responding to a writing prompt. Like, he's given a writing prompt and he works with it, and it's a really good idea, but he doesn't necessarily flesh it out.
Like he had an awesome idea one day out of the blue, and instead of just burying it and saying one day, or dedicating a huge, well thought out, heavily revised novel, he just went out and wrote a cool thing, and people get to see it, and it's really fun.
It was great. Yes. Honestly, I want this to be turned into a TV show because it would be a great one.
Yeah.
It has the whole cop show format down, and I could see that, and I was actually okay with it because the story was interesting enough and the characters were interesting enough, and I was just imagining how this would be done cinematically when you get to see things from his perspective and you see him and like all his friends sitting at a table eating food, and then you see it from someone else's perspective and there's just a big table with a bunch of food on it. And like no one's actually there, and just like seeing the different cut shots and everything, that'd be really great to see.
Yeah, and it's always really interesting when the book starts describing what his allies are doing while people are like talking to him and so on, like what they're doing with their idle time, and like that could be done shot really well on a TV show.
It's really well done, and like whenever he talks to them, he can't just talk in his mind; he has to actually talk to them. And so you get to see him holding a conversation with his I forget what he calls them. You get to see him holding his conversation with his friends, and then someone else is like, "What are you saying?"
So, Abigail, if you were to choose an actor to play that protagonist, who would you choose?
I don't know. Somebody with dark hair.
That is so specific. Okay, we'll go with that.
Somebody, mid-30s dark hair.
All right.
Yeah, just pull someone off the street. It's good.
Like, he would have to be a little bit older. Like, I don't know. I think they just did describe him as his, like, late 30s or something.
Gotcha.
What about Robert De Niro?
Pitt?
Brad Pitt, yeah.
No.
Okay.
That would be terrible.
Both great options.
I don't know who Robert De Niro is.
Okay, that's okay. No one needs to know.
Okay.
I forget who Robert De Niro is, but
I'll send you a Google image in a second. It would have to be like somebody who has like this kind of submissive personality. I don't see this character as a very tough. I own everything, because he's a little self-conscious because of his, his allies. Yeah. That's why he needs all of these people surrounding him to support him. He's a pretty
he doesn't
boring
really
dude.
believe in himself. And from what I can tell, like I was really searching this book to see what his personality was between all of the people, because I know the way that Brandon writes because I have heard him talk about it for 4 years now. But I wanted to see his personality in between all the different people, and it was interesting because he doesn't have much of one. Like he does have one, and he's funny, and he makes his own jokes, and he makes his own thoughts and comments, but you really don't learn a whole lot about him besides these other people, which kind of makes sense because they are him. So it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
And this isn't quite as good or interesting, but if you're interested in kind of a cop procedural show with a protagonist whose mind is split in various ways and sees different people than other people see, check out Awake, which is
I thought you were going to recommend that.
About this guy who one day woke up after a horrible car crash, and his wife was dead and his son was alive. Woke up the next morning, and his son was dead and his wife was alive. And every day he switches between two realities. One being, his wife being alive, one being his son being alive, and he's trying to like connect them and solve mysteries between them. And it was very cool for a season. I don't know if they ever made a second one, but I like the first one.
Yeah.
Neat. Well, speaking of procedural crime shows that are potentially interesting, Steven, you and I watched another episode of Supernatural. Well,
it was weird.
It was weird. Yeah.
But
as always.
It was weird but good, and we're hoping it gets gooder and weirder as time goes on.
Yeah, definitely. Both of those things.
Yeah, we're starting to watch it together now since Steven caught up to where I am. So that's been enjoyable. You have also you are in agreement pretty much with me on how good the show is. So we're on the same page.
Yeah, we haven't, we've seen one episode since we last talked about it. Yeah. It's a slow going to.
But you've seen quite a few since you were last on the show.
I just meant since you last talked about it, which is, a couple of weeks ago.
Right. So you've caught up with me and you're enjoying it. You like Dean.
Yes, I do.
Sam, I don't think he's continue to be interesting, but we're not.
Sam continues to confuse me.
Yeah,
Because he's like Dean from Gilmore Girls. So let's not get into that.
Yeah, that is pretty confusing. The other thing I've been involved with isn't much, as I've just been reading a lot of nonfiction recently. But it's nonfiction that has been using storytelling very effectively.
Oh, good.
Which is what we talked about last week. That, Stephen, I'm sure you've been reading it as well. That book about dog training we've been reading. Begins and ends every chapter with like an anecdote from actual training she's done with dogs. And I think it's very effective at illustrating her point. She's very good at telling those stories.
Yeah, it gets you pulled right in and you start to think, I need to use these techniques too.
Yep. It's just another example of that technique being done very well. But yeah, for me, it's mostly been, I mean, the games I've been playing have been pretty non-narrative ones, and the time I've had for reading and podcasting and stuff has pretty much all been nonfiction. So haven't had a lot of storytelling going on recently, but we can go ahead and jump into our main topic now.
Woohoo!
Woohoo! All right.
Don't
so
you
our
mean
main topic today.
Main topic.
All
As
right.
it says on the page.
That's a good idea. Main topic.
I believe that's Impact Font.
Yeah, that is Impact Font. That is Impact Voice as well. It totally spiked my levels.
There you go.
All
I
right.
just thought I would do that nice transition for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Abigail. So our main topic today is high fantasy. Man, I was about to do a really dumb joke, which I'm not actually going to do. I am going to squelch that joke and actually move on. The first important question about this is, what is high fantasy?
Well, you're going to get a different answer depending on who you ask.
Right, but I'm asking
Ask
you.
me.
And
Okay,
Abigail.
Abigail, what is
Abigail.
high fantasy?
Me?
Yes.
High fantasy. I actually learned this today. I went on Wikipedia and I looked it up because I wasn't totally sure. Because when I think high fantasy, I think of Lord of the Rings. And when I think of Lord of the Rings, I think of elves. And usually...
So you thought high was referring to ear height?
No. Not at all.
Okay.
But
You didn't squelch that joke.
No,
when I
that
think
joke is
of
awesome.
high fantasy, I tend to think of like lofty is the word that I put to it. However, I found out that's not exactly the definition of high fantasy. High fantasy is fantasy that is set in an alternate world that is not this real world, whether it is characters leaving this world to go to that world, or it is that world and this world does not exist, as compared to low fantasy, which is set in this world with magic in it. I always just assumed that was urban fantasy, which is also another thing, which is basically like centered around a city. But yeah, I just learned that, and it really helps me set my definitions now for what kind of fantasy I prefer and what I don't.
Yeah, I was learning a lot as well, because like you, I was confused on it. Another confusing element is gaming has given high fantasy a slightly different meaning as well, especially like Dungeons and Dragons and that sort of thing. Because what high fantasy kind of began compared to low fantasy, it was more like, okay, this campaign we're doing is a low fantasy adventure. That means it's going to be about everyday life. It could still be in a world of dragons and fantasy, but it's just this idea of you're doing everyday things in that world, while high fantasy is like you're going on a crazy journey and fighting necromancers and saving the world. So high fantasy to low fantasy became like a differentiation between how epic of scope the campaign was.
That's
Steven,
another
you were
thing
saying
that tends to come to mind when I think of high fantasy is a big scope.
Exactly. So it really has mixed meanings, which is interesting. So what's interesting about fantasy in general and high fantasy is just how it's developed. Like, fantasy pretty much began with people, I would say mostly with like myths. Really where it came from was people just like making things up about the world, or storytelling through myths and fables and that sort of thing.
It's hard to tell how much of those old stories passed down through generations orally were thought of as fantasy.
Right.
You know, you don't know, did they truly believe that the ogres of the sky would come down and sit on you if you didn't go to bed before 9 p.m.? I don't know.
I still believe that.
That's what I'm going to tell my children.
That's why we need to finish this podcast and need to go to bed.
How much of it was myth that they kind of ended up believing? Nowadays, we make up stories and that's it. We make them up and we know they're made up.
Right.
For the most part. Unless you're getting into allegory, then it's a bit of a different situation. And then as time, passed, then they'd start writing them down, and then you get into your epics, your epics like the Iliad or Beowulf and that sort of thing. And I guess that's kind of the roots of where J.R.R. Tolkien and, he was kind of stretching back and looking at that sort of thing. But the buck kind of stops with Tolkien himself. He certainly wasn't the first man, I'm sure, to write a high fantasy story, but he was the one who pop culturized it, essentially.
Yeah, Tolkien is a good place to start because, like, the roots of fantasy in general is just so deep and so varied from culture to culture that it would take us a very long time to be able to research and speak intelligently about that. But Tolkien is what really brought high fantasy, in quotes, to the public consciousness.
And something that's specific about his and that has not exactly tainted, I would say, the rest of fantasy, but his was specifically modeled after a lot of old English stories as opposed to other stories. So like his was on the concept of like fairy, which was a completely different term back then. But his was based on like the old English poems, things like Beowulf, things that came from the English Germanic line, as opposed to anything that was like Eastern or whatever. And so it has a very interesting flavor to it that, since most of our modern fantasy is based off of Tolkien, it also has that same flavor.
That's a really good point, and that's why so much fantasy is like, medieval swords and castles instead of, like there's a lot of, for example, Arabian fantasy with Arabian knights and genies and that sort of thing. But if those come into modern fantasy, they're typically the exotic locales.
Exactly.
But, the center of it is the human settlements and the castles and the dragons and that sort of thing.
It's very, very westernized.
Exactly, because Tolkien was a man who very much admired his own people and his own culture and wanted to center things there.
And see, there's people will knock that kind of Eurocentric mentality.
Yep.
But I think the only problem with it, well, maybe not the only problem, but the biggest problem is how homogenized it became.
Right.
Tolkien made such a popular, well-loved tale that inspired so many people, that it kind of turned into a big, great burning trail of copycats in a way.
Yeah.
And the way they copied, and not everything, like Tolkien's writing style hasn't stuck around, that's for sure. Many of the themes have disappeared too, but the things that stay are the swords and castles and elves, because it's just, I think that's why we say he's the creator of high fantasy, because no, he's not the creator of fantasy. And in the strictest sense, maybe not even high fantasy, but everyone kind of agreed automatically and accidentally that the Lord of the Rings is your textbook on what high fantasy is.
Here's where the waters get very muddied, though. We've defined high fantasy as something existing in another world. We've defined Lord of the Rings as the creator of high fantasy. What actually surprised me, and something I'm surprised I didn't know before, is Tolkien made it very clear that Lord of the Rings takes place in the real world. It's just in the past.
Right. And I think that the way you get around that is to say it's far removed. Just like Star Wars technically takes place galaxies away and a long time ago. It's still in our world, but it's so far removed it's famous.
Yeah, but it was very interesting to me. There are a bunch of letters from Tolkien that expounded upon this. And one quote from him that I found interesting that I hadn't heard before was, quote, "It meant the habitable lands of our world." He's talking about the word Middle Earth here. So back to the quote, "set amid the surrounding ocean. The action of the story takes place in the northwest of Middle Earth, equivalent in latitude to the coastlands of Europe and the north shores of the Mediterranean. If Hobbiton and Rivendell are taken as intended to be at about the latitude of Oxford, then Minas Tirith, 600 miles south, is at about the latitude of Florence. The mouths of Anduin in the ancient city of Peлагir, or Pelagalir, I don't even know how to pronounce that, are at about the latitude of ancient Troy," end quote. I did not realize he was making it that explicitly analogous to the real world.
Oh yeah, he was big on fantasy and really big on, history. He was very big on history and geography and etymology, and everything that he did had a root in something else. The languages he created had roots in other languages, and he actually, the maps that he made, I remember, was reading Silmarillion.
Yep.
And he goes into a lot of detail about the land and the maps and how everything is shaped and how this event happened and that's why this isn't on the map anymore and why this happened and this isn't on there. And he talks about the different ages and how things progress. And it is very, very specific that he is writing about his own people, but before the times that he even enjoyed reading about, because he enjoyed reading about, King Arthur and times before. And so he's like, well, what about the time before, and where did all of this come from? And so he was basically, instead of writing the origin of our world, he was writing the origin of that world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. He was, he was trying to make it also sufficiently vague enough that, it wasn't completely unbelievable, that it could be the history of our world, which I did not at all realize was his goal before I started reading up on this. But you're right. He was a very historically minded, and I just never realized it affected this world that specifically.
To me, I always knew that, he kind of intended it, at the very least in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, to take place on our Earth, our world, just because he addresses the reader and says, you don't see hobbits around anymore since the big people took over. But yeah, I had no idea he had kind of mapped it out before. That's kind of crazy.
Right.
Cool.
It also makes me understand a little more the critics of Tolkien that have since said, criticized him for potentially being a little racist, a little culturally insensitive, and I see a lot more merit to that, especially now that I see how explicitly analogous he is being to the real world.
Oh, yes. He was, yes.
I think also...
He was an old English gent, and he portrayed that.
Exactly, and it's kind of a bummer. I wish he'd been a little bit more forward-thinking. Something tells me that C.S. Lewis would have been, if he'd written an equivalent series, would have been a little bit more considerate.
Well, I don't know. C.S. Lewis is kind of weird, too.
Is he bad, too? That's a good point.
The thing is, there's
the difference between C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, from what I know of their worlds, is that C.S. Lewis also wrote about other cultures, but he wrote about how they could be redeemed and at least a part of our culture. Tolkien kind of just wrote them as villains.
The thing is, I will admit that Tolkien was fairly closed-minded. He didn't have any characters pretty much outside of where he lived.
Yes.
And mostly there were just wars in the East and shadows in the East and other weird things in the East. But I don't think it was done with any kind of malevolence or anger. Or at least I never sensed that, especially since there are moments where, Samwise watches the warriors from the Mumakil fall to the ground, and he wonders, this guy didn't want this. He just wants to go back to his family. He understands that people are people no matter where they are. It just doesn't come into the writing very much. I almost think it's more ignored rather than abused.
Yeah, I don't know. People have gone pretty in depth in that, and I haven't read a lot of the surrounding materials about Lord of the Rings. That's a really big topic on its own. I just think, I did not realize how explicitly analogous it was to the real world, so I think it leads a lot more weight to those criticisms of Tolkien. Also interesting is I think that's one reason we get such a disconnect from modern fantasy, which has modeled itself after Tolkien. It feels so weird how their worlds are completely apart from ours with completely different geography and completely different rules and magic and all that stuff, but still our cultures are there. And that feels really off. Wow, that's just Arabia, but in something else, or, that's just Europe, or that's just France, but in a fantasy world. And they're just we're being like Tolkien, and they are, but Tolkien, there was a reason Tolkien's cultures were so explicitly like other cultures.
One of the things that made his cultures better than a lot of the fantasy cultures that I've come across since then, where his were a lot more well thought out. They were based on, instead of being based on a thing that was based on the culture, it was actually based on the culture, and he weaved a lot of background stuff into that, and he did a lot of research, and he made them fit together really well, not just surface things. So you think of Arabia, and there are things that you can throw in there that say, oh yeah, this is, an Arabic culture. But rather than just throwing in some of that, every single thing that he did from that person's point of view, every action that they took had to do with that culture. And it was actually a culture instead of just a make-believe. And that's one of the problems that I see in a lot of modern high fantasy, is that those cultures are not really as developed as his are, and they're not as subtly explicit, I suppose, in the way that they act. Sometimes it can be oh yeah, this is this culture, but these people are acting apart from that. But the writer just doesn't realize that.
I think that's a really good point. It's more just oh, this is a cool aesthetic, or this is a cool idea. Now we'll just turn it into a culture.
Yeah, you just kind of drop it on top instead of reforming your people and saying, okay, no, if they were raised this way, what would they be doing now? How would they be thinking? How would they be talking? How would they be whatever?
Yep, exactly. So that's a really good point. That kind of moves on to, I think, our next question here pretty well. What do y'all think of high fantasy? Do you like it? Do you not like it?
Not particularly. I think it depends.
Yeah, Abigail, you go ahead and start. Like,
Well,
what is your opinion on high fantasy?
I'm trying to think of a high fantasy that I really, really like besides Lord of the Rings.
Right.
And it's really hard for me, but maybe it's because I've stayed away from a lot of it. I actually didn't even like Lord of the Rings when I first encountered it. It took me, so I was like 7 when the first movie came out. And so I hadn't read the books. I had not read the books beforehand. So I saw all 3 of the movies because my dad was a big fan. And I was like, yeah, whatever, it's scary, I don't like it. Then later, I think I was like in a class or something, we had to read The Hobbit for the class, and I went, I don't like this. I want my friends from the other one back. And like at that moment, I decided that I liked Lord of the Rings.
So only your hatred of other fantasy could make you into a fantasy.
Pretty much. But once I got into it, I really got into it, and I like the historical aspect of it. I like how well everything's put together, the motivations, the depth of plot. And because of that, I feel like I've been ruined for a lot of other similar things. It's because they just don't measure up. And it makes me really sad. And I've actually found myself to be a much, much bigger fan of low fantasy because I love things like chick flicks and Friends and things that happen in the real world and small problems like relationship problems or like thrillers or things like that. And so if you add a magical element on top of that, I'm sold and it's awesome. But it's really hard for me to completely pick myself out of my world and put myself in a completely different world. It's just really hard.
Yeah, it's partially hard because it's so easy to poke holes in them. It's you're wondering, why is this so different, yet why is this also so similar?
And that could be one reason I liked Lord of the Rings better is because it's more like our world. It's just an older version of it.
It makes sense. I mean, what Lord of the Rings really is a historical low fantasy.
Yeah.
It's not really high fantasy at all. High fantasy, I don't know enough about it, but a lot of modern high fantasy to me really seems like it almost misinterpreted Tolkien like I used to. And then created these worlds, assuming, well, he just make it up and make it elves and stuff, and then didn't create the same backing that he did.
In a way,
and now they're kind of stuck.
In a way, The Lord of the Rings is almost simply biblical, because it's a world in which the world is our own, but you can see the miracles sometimes. You know, like if you were to read through the Bible and the Red Sea parts or something like that, that's something that could happen in The Lord of the Rings. Not often, not in a flashy manner most of the time. But it does happen. These characters can see it and can follow along that adventure. Of course, there are also orcs and crazy, creatures such as that. But oftentimes, you just have hobbits in the Shire, which is pretty much just people living in England. You know,
I mean, orcs and trolls aren't any more fantastical than dinosaurs. So again, it's it's not like it's not like it's a world that far removed from our own.
It's really not that different. And everything that you, like, whenever I read through it, it does feel very historic, very much like, oh, I mean, well, it said that it happened, so obviously it did. And I'm not questioning, oh, well, why did that happen? And why did this person do that? Everything has its motivations right there. It's like I'm reading a history text and saying, oh, well, of course World War I led to World War II. Like, I mean, it was bound to happen.
Exactly. A lot of other fantasy seems kind of like it's being made up by the seat of its pants. As someone who's kind of created fantasy before, I see how easy it is to fall into those same tropes and problems. Steven.
High fantasy is pretty important to me. The Lord of the Rings is probably my favorite story. It probably means the most out of all stories to me. Over time, I believe my attachment to high fantasy as a concept has lessened.
Yeah, same here.
Perhaps it's just broadening perspective, reading different genres, and just experiencing more of life, and realizing that oftentimes life and the people in it are more interesting than other worlds.
Yep.
That said, I still just can't get enough of that experience of stepping into a different land. And I think I oftentimes get that from video games more than books.
I agree, because in video games, you get to also explore these different lands. So it paints a broader and fuller and more engaging picture than just reading. A book is so much about the characters that you kind of just want them to be more relatable and more realistic. It's not that fascinating in books to, read about a different environment once you've been able to explore that environment in real time.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like you take, say, the Stormlight Archives, and boy, do I love that world, and it's fun to learn about. But exploring World of Warcraft or the Elder Scrolls and wondering what's going to be above this waterfall and what does this town mean and who lives here. And it's a lot more fun when you get to explore it yourself.
Right.
But yeah, I certainly like high fantasy, but it oftentimes disappoints me, and it has so many problems and tropes that it's hard to throw your lot in with it wholesale.
Exactly. I agree with that a lot. I think what I really enjoy about it is very different from what Lord of the Rings was trying to do. I think it's become a different animal. If you take the Stormlight Archives, for example, if you were to do take that same plot and try to put it in the real world, you couldn't get that same sense of exploration. The mysteries they're solving about the very fundamentals of the world would start to feel like a goofy, serialized, like paranoid, all the conspiracy theories are true kind of thing. You can't make up that much about the world. You can't change the fundamentals and realize that's why the Shattered Plains are here. It'd like be trying to be a book explaining why Stonehenge exists, and it would start to feel pretty stupid. Because it's creating a new canvas in which you can learn about broader things than just the relationships of characters or all war or something like that.
But if you create enough distance, and I don't mean to interrupt you, you can continue on with your point, but if you create enough distance, like in the Lord of the Rings, you sort of start to believe maybe all of this is vaguely what formed our lives right now. And you can make up your own connections, but it's not explaining to you why the Grand Canyon is so big.
Right, but I even like the idea of something not existing in our world, just existing in an alternate world that's based on ours. It doesn't have to be literally our world. I mean, I love that concept. Lord of the Rings is its own thing, but I think it's cool that something was apart from our world, because if you look at sci-fi as well, most of that also just takes place in our world.
I agree.
Superheroes also take place in our world. So high fantasy is kind of the last refuge of literally just creating another world. It doesn't all have to make sense, but it gives you like this creative canvas that most other fiction doesn't give you.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's super true.
But I don't think that's the weird thing, is I don't think the roots are really in there. If you look at myth and you look at Tolkien, almost all of that is in our world.
So how did that when did it depart? When did it change? How did it change?
I don't know. An interesting form of this is seen. Someone categorized low fantasy into several different categorizations. I think it was, trying to find the name of the person. Nikki Gamble apparently described it as this. And the three ways are primary and does not exist. That would be something like the Wheel of Time or Discworld. A second is entered through a portal from the primary world, which is something like Alice in Wonderland. And then world within a world, which is something like Harry Potter. Maybe the entering through a portal from our world is one way this is really able to develop, because that makes it very explicit that this world is just different. That's something like Narnia.
In a way, it's almost daring the reader to suspend their disbelief. Like look back at Alice in Wonderland, and it's like, yeah, here's a normal little girl, and she walks through a looking glass, aka mirror, you old people, and goes to the strange drug-infused world.
We don't get into that.
and it's like, okay, I get where it diverged. I understand that I'm not supposed to believe this because it's so unbelievable.
Right.
And sometimes it's a little bit easier to digest those, in my opinion, than starting. It's different. Okay, it's. I'm not going to say one's better than the other, because one is definitely not better than the other. But sometimes it can be easier for a reader to digest the portal into another world, because usually when that happens, the person who is venturing into that world, there is at least one character in the party who does not know anything about the world.
Or is skeptical about it as well.
Yeah, and so you get to see things through their eyes, and you have someone that you can kind of relate to and say, oh, I don't know what's happening, this person's going to tell me. And if you notice that,
continue.
even actually in the Narnia books, that pretty much happens every time. There's at least one person in the party who doesn't know and who's never been there. And so I've personally found that a little bit easier to get through, just because of the way that it's set up, than something that just drops me into this big fantasy world with lots of strange names and strange places and strange things. And it's definitely a different experience. I have to work a lot harder to understand the first one, which is totally going to appeal to a certain type of person, because there are people who are saying, I don't want to just read something about what I'm doing now. I want to read something big. And it's different.
The strange names are definitely a big hang-up for a lot of people, because often they're also really bad in a lot of fantasy. and they feel unnecessary.
I even had trouble with names in Lord of the Rings, honestly.
Yeah. But at least they were well conceived for the most
Bryan
part.
and I always joke about playing World of Warcraft and seeing role players, and how the elves have names entirely built up of E's and L's.
There's so
Pretty
many
much.
of them. They're like impossible.
Vowels. It's just a mouthful of vowels.
But as for your main point there, yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, other people prefer just going into a completely other world. I'm one of those people. Like, I don't much care for having the everyman from our world. Like, I don't find that concept very engaging. I don't typically find it super interesting compared to just having to learn how these people interact with each other. Because I think the reason I prefer people existing is if it's written well, you're learning about the world implicitly from what's going on in it. While when there's someone there, there's so much explicit narration going on about what's going on. They have to over-explain it to you. One game that's
Go ahead.
One example of this that's really amazing for me, the Portal into Another World, is the Myst series. And I think it's my favorite example of that.
That's such a good series.
And it even keeps it secret that it's the real world. Like, it does not make it explicit at all that it is the real world, but it is. And it's about these people literally writing other worlds and then going to them. And you're this faceless and nameless protagonist in first person, just exploring them and finding books there. And it does such an incredible job of creating other worlds you're exploring, but anchoring them to our world through its own rules. So I think that's like my favorite example of that.
Yeah.
That type of portal into another world type of fantasy.
Something that's kind of interesting about stuff like that, and this kind of has to do with high fantasy that I just thought of this. It's kind of off topic, but high fantasy, I can see how that would have a higher payoff than some other kind of fantasy necessarily, especially when you get into something like a video game like that, like Myst, where it's very open and you have to figure out what to do. I can see how that would actually give the player or the experiencer or the reader or whatever you're doing a much more satisfied experience once you come out, because you actually had to work for what you got and you had to figure it out and you feel really smart.
Right.
As opposed to being led by the hand through something like, reading the Narnia books and whatnot. It is a very, very different experience. And you're kind of like, oh yeah, that was a great story. I can see how all that lined up, instead of like, oh wow, I discovered this and figured out that and then that happened, and it's just a bigger payoff.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Steven.
Hello.
What are some of your favorite examples of high fantasy? Because you definitely talked a lot about, the drawbacks and where Lord of the Rings comes from. But apart from Lord of the Rings, like, what are some high fantasy you've enjoyed and why do you think you did?
Morrowind.
So Elder Scrolls.
Yeah, let me talk about Morrowind specifically.
Sure.
And Abigail, you were saying how you kind of had to work for the payoff in high fantasy. I think this is a great example of it. And I'd also elaborate by saying, you step into the world of Morrowind and other Elder Scrolls games. This is a video game series, in case you listeners weren't aware. An RPG series, in fact. All about exploring a great, grand, epic fantasy world, and you get to do whatever you want.
Yeah, that's what really makes it stand apart from other games, is just the complete freedom. It gives pretty much more freedom than almost any other video game out there.
And utter detail. You can pick up essentially every object in the whole world and hoard it in your house.
Yes.
But if you put too many things in your house, then they start disappearing and they go into a glitchy realm.
So it creates really a sandbox world for you to explore. What made Morrowind really stand out is it was the first game that was entirely handcrafted instead of like procedurally generated. So they just took like one small section of the geography of the large world and just made that as detailed as they could. So anyway, go on to your point, Stephen.
Well, the reason I enjoy it so much is because one of my favorite words is explore and exploration as well. Because there's nothing more satisfying to me than not knowing what's around the corner and having the complete freedom to go see what it is and to learn something along the way. And in Morrowind, because it is totally separated from our world, sure, there's armor. You'll run into, human-like people, cultures you may kind of relate with. But essentially, it's a brand new landscape that you've never seen before. So when you see this great gelatinous, strange, faintly glowing jellyfish creature floating through the air, you wonder, what is that? And you start to freak out. Is it going to hurt me? Am I going to die? I don't want to lose, any progress. Where am I? What is it? And once you work up the courage to go near it, you find out it doesn't hurt you. In fact, none of them hurt you. And you see a small herd of them over the hill, and you're like, what is this? And you talk to the villagers, and they don't really tell you anything. But as you move throughout the world, you slowly learn, people herd those like specific, like sort of like sky cattle in a way, and they have certain properties that help with harvests, and you get to learn about a whole new, economy and ecosystem and the way cultures interact with each other that you really couldn't have in our world because it's too familiar to be mysterious. And that's just so rewarding. And you can really only get it from high fantasy.
It's also a really good way of using video games in conjunction with high fantasy, because something video games have that movies and storytelling can't have, unless you make it like really obtuse in a book and have to read it multiple times, is creating implicit storytelling that is player created in the order you learn things. In a book, it's going to tell you things in a specific order. But when you explore Morrowind, you might find this book first and this culture first and connect it in a way that no one else did, because you went, much like the real world, you learned things in your own order.
Yeah. And I mean, it's still fun to explore a well-written, well-crafted book.
Oh, yeah.
For sure. Because the plot can be so much more intricate and interesting.
Right. But we were talking about why fantasy, video games and fantasy interest us more than books at this point. I think that's a large reason why, is it takes advantage of that idea of a interconnected world more than a book does in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And, well, a book that does that really well, or a series, is Discworld, though, you mentioned before.
Yes.
And that truly capitalizes on high fantasy, because it's the complete bizarre nature of discovery that makes those books so awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. But inversely, video games are terrible at making good characters. So that's one reason books are much better at more character-focused genres. I don't think high fantasy necessarily isn't as intricately linked to good characters as other ones, just because they have so much of the world to draw from.
And if you see a weird landscape with a jellyfish creature, you're going to get a lot more out of it, potentially, than trying to get to know the jellyfish creature as a person, because it's very hard to write that. It's very hard to make a character completely alien to what you understand and still interesting, because humans are just so self-centric, because it's all we understand. Right. And so if you're not like us, then we're like, I don't know what you're saying. It's boring.
Yeah, when I used to roleplay in World of Warcraft, we ran into that exact problem, because we were trying to make characters like we always were sticking with like the elves and the humans. And maybe the dwarves. And when we tried to branch out to the more like otherworldly races, we were having a lot of trouble making compelling characters because they felt so other. Like, it almost didn't make sense that this weird, crazy cow thing would behave like a human. It just, it was tough to really see yourself in that, or see a variety. You could only think of like one or two characters.
It would be the Wookiee syndrome. Every Wookiee is Chewbacca because that is the only Wookiee you know. You don't know the Wookiee language. You don't know the Wookiee subtleties. So every Wookiee is Chewbacca. Now you can have Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, and even Darth Vader in the same room, and you're like, they're practically different species.
Right.
But no, all Wookiees are Chewbacca. What?
Right. I said, well, he's more machine now than man.
That's debatable.
I do feel like that's one of that is the defining characteristic right there, the otherness that separates high fantasy into such a either so well loved or so widely hated genre. It's like, it's either loved or hated usually. And I think that right there is the pain point that a lot of people have to get over, because they have to accept, that's not, I don't understand this. What is this? Ugh, I don't like it. Or, I don't understand this. What is this? I want to learn about it. And it's two very opposite reactions.
I don't know, but I could see it being very important that you're introduced to high fantasy when you're young. Because when you're young, you're way more curious about things and way more open. So the concepts won't seem stupid to you once you're old and jaded and try to learn it.
That's definitely something I've noticed with people that I talk to. Those who weren't raised on it don't like it.
Yep. Exactly. Both my parents don't really care for it at all, and neither of them are raised with it at all. While Steven and I were completely raised on it. So
I mean, I heard you guys talking about everyone's first book as a fantasy, an epic fantasy.
Right.
And that's just stupidly true for me. I mean, like, I have a document that's, as my first serious attempt at a story, it's, 200 pages long, and that's just the notes. Like, I went for it, and that's, I have a much more complex and long history with fantasy than, I guess, or high fantasy than we can get into right now. But I went through the whole cycle of, really, really loving it to the point where it was almost the only thing I would read. And I still have a great respect for it, but because I stumbled through it that way, I know all of the mistakes that people have made and it's harder to look away from them, I guess.
Yeah, pretty much. I agree with that. All right. Anything you guys wanted to talk about fantasy that we didn't cover yet?
There was one thing that I did want to mention, actually.
Go ahead.
Maybe a bit of a rabbit trail, but you had a question on here that I don't remember what we're on or where we've moved now, but you were talking about the drawbacks. We talked about this a while back. And we were talking about how the stories tend to be repeated. They tend to be Lord of the Rings reportrayals. And something that I actually thought of before we even started was, in high fantasy, the one of the things that I've noticed about it is the most common story that's told within it is the hero's journey. And I feel like that goes hand in hand with high fantasy. And I'm not actually sure why that goes hand in hand with it. But have y'all noticed that? And I also just kind of wanted to get y'all's take on why the hero's journey is so prominent, because almost every story that you'll read now is like, it's, the little kid does this and whatnot and moves on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's frustratingly linked to that one archetype, honestly.
It's actually really, really annoying. That's one reason I don't like it.
Because everything we've talked about, and some of our best examples, Myst, Elder Scrolls, totally aren't that story.
Not at all. And they're way more interesting.
Right, they're capitalizing on what's interesting about fantasy, in my opinion. The Legend of Zelda is an example of one that totally is the hero's journey. Also not a very interesting story, for the most part. Like, I like Zelda, don't get me wrong. I just wouldn't go to it to say, like, this is fantastic storytelling. I think one reason it's so linked, Lord of the Rings was a hero's journey.
True.
So it's probably people looking at that once again for inspiration. I would call Star Wars another. Oh, yeah. I know it's sci-fi, but it's high fantasy in a lot of ways. It's
totally fantasy and it's totally hero's journey.
And it's a hero's journey.
And another one that I always think of is Aragon, which everyone says is Star Wars in fantasy. It totally
as critical
makes sense.
As people are of the prequels in Star Wars, something I really appreciate about them is they cared much more about creating a larger context of the world than telling a hero's journey in that. They were telling a tragic fall of a hero through Anakin, but they were trying to paint this broader picture of the Jedi and the Republic and all these different interconnected planets and wars, which, while got a little boring and confusing to some people, at least wasn't just, the traditional hero story that they told in the original trilogy.
It totally makes sense. One of the biggest criticisms of those three movies is that the characters are flat. And the characters, something that I was actually asked recently was, describe Han Solo. You're not allowed to use any visual words, and so you start coming, he's cocky, he's funny, he's whatever, and then they turn around and say, okay, so now describe Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it's really tough to do.
Oh, I can do that fantastically. I think Obi-Wan Kenobi's an amazing character. One of the best characters
he is, but you have to think of Obi-Wan Kenobi in the first movie.
Oh gosh. In Phantom Menace?
That's where you're going. Yeah, Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Phantom Menace. Sorry,
annoying.
I wasn't. Yeah, exactly. And stuck so up, when you think of the two that way, you can find a much higher quality of character in the second one. So that's actually a really good contrast between the two. One is more high fantasy in that it's going for the scope in the world, and then the other one is much more of the
low
smaller. This is how he changes throughout this.
Yeah, and if you look at also like how grimy and realistic the original trilogy was trying to be, and how kind of sleek and other the prequels were trying to be. And I think that's something a lot of people missed about the prequels, and why I think they brought in a lot that the original trilogy didn't have. They added a lot of texture to that world that I think was pretty cool, and a lot of lore to that world. It wasn't always a hit, but I think people were kind of missing the broader point of what they were trying to do with those movies by just directly relating them to the original trilogy. Because, like we were saying, they're kind of doing different aspects of fantasy.
They're a completely different series, really.
Yeah.
One was superior than the other for sure, but they were a different series.
I think the plot they were trying to tell in the prequels and the world they were trying to create were compelling. I just think they wrote it very poorly.
And acted and directed. And anyways, continue.
Yes, exactly. How do we get onto that? What were we talking about more broadly
Hero's Journey.
Hero's Journey.
I went on a tangent.
Any thoughts about how the hero's journey and fantasy interrelate?
You guys covered a lot of thoughts. I pretty much just let you take it because I knew you were going to say the same thing. I think it's so connected because Lord of the Rings, it's the same reason. Elves are connected to fantasy. There's no reason people had to keep making elves. Why are elves still in every, Facebook game you play just because it's part of pop culture now?
I wonder if the hero's journey existed in fantasy before Lord of the Rings, though.
I think so. I think that when you look back and you see some of the epics like Beowulf, the hero's journey was an important part of coming of age. Like that's how people told myths.
Yeah, the root of myths is often very moralistic and empowering about a human's journey. So I can see it being pretty interconnected in that respect.
Yeah. So I think that there's a reason Tolkien used it, because it does have a connection.
Right.
And the reason people kept using it is because Tolkien used it.
Because he popularized it. And I also agree it's a huge problem. It's tough to tell a compelling hero's journey at this point. It's so easy to just be trite and boring. I think Japanese RPGs and their type of fantasy still uses this constantly and does it very poorly for the most part. And that ruins most of their stories for me. Yeah. All right. Any other high fantasy thoughts before we close out here?
Well, I suppose my last thoughts are I really enjoy high fantasy that are based in other cultures, like example being Avatar.
Love that.
Another hero's journey.
A hero's journey, but from the eastern side of things. Not the creators per se, but certainly the world. And also that despite all my ups and downs, high fantasy is still pretty much my favorite genre of fiction. And I just, like I said before, there's nothing better to me than being able to explore a brand new, well thought out world.
I agree with that. My last thought is I used to like high fantasy more, but I like low fantasy more now that I realize Buffy is low fantasy. Also, Death Note is low fantasy. Yeah. They're very good.
I just love low fantasy, honestly. I could do without high fantasy. It's great. But I like, I don't know. I feel like I'm more easily able to enjoy the other stuff, but I think that's a personality thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think both of them have lots of ups and downs.
Oh, yeah. There's some great things about both and some terrible things about both.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just get excited about high fantasy that lets me explore the world and isn't just trying to basically tell a normal story, but with a couple changed words and a lot of jargon. All right. I think that went pretty well. I like talking about fantasy.
Yeah. I agree on both those points.
I would love to do something on sci-fi, except I feel none of us are equipped.
Hey.
Have you read sci-fi? I really haven't.
I haven't really read a lot of sci-fi, but I think most of the sci-fi people consume nowadays is movies. I read Ender's Game.
Oh, I did too. I didn't love it. I thought the characters were boring.
Well, I mean, they were 30-year-olds in 8-year-old bodies, so that was kind of weird.
I know, it was weird. I don't like Ender's Game. Sci-fi annoys me because I feel like all the authors are spaced out and so preoccupied with what their thoughts of the future are. They have a very hard time writing compellingly in the present.
You know what, Brian? I think this would be a great discussion to have on the sci-fi episode. But for now,
I don't even want to make one. I just want to insult sci-fi in passing without knowing much about it.
Well, I'm really tempted to start discussing this with you, but it's going to turn into a Frozen topic where we talk for 3 hours and everyone has to hear it.
Bonus episode. Yeah,
if you just stick an unfair, biased viewpoint on sci-fi at the end of a high fantasy episode, I don't think you'll get any backlash.
How am I supposed to argue with you? I could slap you around real good.
I've read and seen very little sci-fi, but I have been turned off from a lot of what I've seen.
The only science fiction I like is Star Wars, and then I realize it's not science fiction, so.
I feel like my relation to sci-fi is very similar to Abigail's relation to high fantasy.
I think so. I think I'm a little bit more into the sci-fi side of it than you are, because that's what I was raised on.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, your dad's super into sci-fi. Also, Star Trek is stupid.
Now get out of here right now.
I know. I need to see more of it. But man,
no, it's actually really poorly written, but it's so good. Right. But it's so bad. Anyways,
last thought to leave on is I really wish there were more video games like Myst or Morrowind to let me explore sci-fi universe like that. There are so few. It's annoying. They're all like space sims and shooters. But anyway, we will move on from that for now. Maybe someone will hear that and develop an awesome game.
Anarchy Online.
Good point. I have one comment on that.
Go ahead.
Low-hanging fruit. Move on.
What?
That would be why. Low-hanging fruit.
Oh, okay.
It's so easy.
What, to make space?
No, it's easy to play a first-person shooter and make a first-person shooter and understand a first-person shooter and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everything about the process is easy.
That's true. You're right.
So that's probably why there's so many of them. Because they're popular because of
Mass Effect.
Mass Effect does let you do that, but Mass Effect is poorly written in a lot of other ways that I won't go into right now.
We need to end this podcast.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Now, what I love about it is we do this really well thought out episode, then we just throw out a bunch of unbased opinions that people get mad at. It's basically just bait so people will email us angrily.
You know what? Let's have an entire episode where we just sit here and we just each throw out opinions and no one's allowed to argue.
I love this idea. It's like lightning round. Okay. I just like throw out an author name. You start insulting, we just move on to the next thing.
Anyways.
Right. So thank you everyone for joining us. If you want to find us on Twitter, we are Third Person Show. If you want to email us, we are thirdpersonshow@gmail.com. We are on YouTube now. Luckily, we have Ariel, Abigail's sister, putting all our stuff up there, and I want to thank her for doing that. It's lovely to have someone else be able to help with the production side of things. You can find us at Third Person, a storytelling podcast. We are a part of the Whales Are Whales Productions Network, and you can find us there at whalesareWhales.com. You'll find our show there on the front page. If you want to find us personally on Twitter, I am Lord Meldor. That is LordMeldor. Steven is Stephen Kelly 180, and Abigail is the Thinky Reader. Thank you both for coming.
That was such an awkward silence.